Hello there, this is James Croft, it is 1978, and rereading the book How Democracies Die earlier this year, I was struck by the terrifying thought that far from surrendering at the Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, the South, for lack of a better term, merely signed an armistice that lasted for 99 years, because as the authors of that book point out, the hashtag civility and mutual respect, which, with the exceptions of the likes of McCarthyism, dominated American politics from the Compromise of 1877 to the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, was built almost entirely upon white supremacy and single-party dominance in the South. That, in short, having seceded and begun the Civil War for literally no other reason than because they feared that the election of Abraham Lincoln would lead to the, apologies for the racist term, niggification of America, it was only when the federal government once again threatened white supremacy in the South, after agreeing to turn a blind eye to it for almost a century, that politicians in the southern states, the states themselves, and later the entire Republican Party and its voting base would begin to view their political opponents not merely as a rival or an enemy to be defeated, but as a demonic and treacherous existential threat whose leaders raped and murdered children as part of satanic rituals, and thus simply had to be annihilated by any means necessary. So, of course, this brings up the terrifying question of whether the US is now on the brink of a second civil war that, no different from the first, is only inevitable because insecure white boys can't accept that the world is changing and simply refuse to adapt, or rather, given what I said a moment ago about the South never really surrendering, whether the cold civil war that has been raging for more than half a century is about to grow hot once again. After all, having never done so since they'd repatriated, the southern states literally only began flying the Confederate flag over their state houses, courthouses, and what have you, as a counter-protest against the African-American civil rights movement around the same time that Republicans began adopting the Southern strategy, promising to keep America white. And now, as Trump, Mike Pence, and their token puppet of Jesse refuse to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power, declaring that the election result will only be legitimate if he wins, radicalized far-right domestic terrorists, militias, because they're only terrorists if they're not white or are fighting against the creation of a white fascist Christian theocracy, have taken Trump's calls to liberate Michigan, to liberate Virginia, to stand back and stand by, and Don Jr.'s calls to enlist in an army of supporters to protect the polls as a literal call to arms, as a rallying cry to create a literal army, already planning one failed attack against the Democratic politician, and no doubt planning countless more. So especially if Biden wins and is inaugurated in January, but even if he does not, as the article links down as the Underbar puts it, America is entering its years of lead, a term first coined in Italy to describe decades of political violence and terrorism, in which, to quote the article, by contrast, the latter-day American pursuit of the strategy of tension is carried out largely in the open. The armed far-right doesn't need a covert network to supply it with military equipment because America is awash with legal weapons. Militias and vigilantes don't need to maintain underground communications networks because social media platforms allow them to operate freely. Police chat up the gunmen as they both eye BLM protesters. And while the revelations regarding the Italian security services and political establishment's relationship to right-wing violence didn't fully emerge until police and parliament investigated them in the 1990s, Republicans have publicly embraced figures like Kyle Rittenhouse, the alleged Kenosha shooter, whom Fox News has transformed into a folk hero. So while the chances of a second literal civil war with states seceding and declaring war on the federal government are becoming increasingly remote, not least because, with the exception of California, the idea of the individual states as being self-contained political, economic and military entities is largely a thing of the past, and this time, as far as I can tell, there is no major political and economic force like the plantation-owning southern aristocracy that is terrified of losing power. The kind of white supremacist terrorists who worship Trump as their messiah will continue to be the greatest terrorist threat in America until Republicans stop ignoring, courting, apologizing for, and glorifying them, until police stop regarding them as backup, until the US military purges its ranks of white supremacist hate groups, until Jack, Zuckerberg, and the rest of the social media giants stop allowing them to radicalize vulnerable teenagers and young adults online because racist lies equals clicks equals profit. And in short, as one tweet eloquently put it, until white supremacy is seen as a white issue that we as white people need to solve, not a black issue to empathise with.